I think the biggest lesson that all of us have seen over the past several years is the big lie when it comes to inflation and how it robs the average worker and even some of the upper middle class folks. Welcome everybody, I'm Bob Murphy, Chief Economist here at Infineo. I got my PhD in economics way back in 2003. I've been studying monetary and banking theory ever since then. And what I'm going to do in this video is give you a summary of some of the major developments in personal finance and just broader economic theory and economic policy that has really hit the profession, let's say over the past 35 years. And I'm going to give the top 9 biggest lessons that I've learned, and I'm going to do it all in under 60 minutes. So let's get straight into it. The first thing that I've learned. So specifically what happened is after the financial crisis in 2008, the Federal Reserve came in, started dumping in multiple rounds of what was called QE, quantitative easing. And it's true, some of us were alarmed about the prospects of impending inflation, and the conventional wisdom was that, oh yeah, they were just crying wolf, nothing bad happened. Well, the problem is sometimes there really is a wolf. And so what we saw specifically was then when COVID kicked in, and now the Fed started dumping in even more money than they had during the rounds of QE and in a much shorter time frame. Again, critics of excessive Federal Reserve looseness were warning this is going to hurt the dollar, this is going to hurt consumers, you're going to see prices zoom. And all of the respectable people were assuring folks at home, no, these guys are crazy, don't worry about it, they're fear-mongering. And we can see lots of clips of people doing just that. Okay, so of course, as we all know, they were wrong. That even though the pundits kept coming forth and even some Nobel laureates and saying, no, this is all transitory, this is just supply-side bottlenecks, don't worry about it. After a while, they had to throw in the towel on that one, and then it pivoted. It went from the narrative was, oh, inflation's not happening, don't worry, to, oh yeah, it's happened a little bit here and there, but it's not a big deal. And then it flips to, yes, inflation's happening, and it's a good thing, right? This was actually the stance that a lot of progressive economists were taking, presumably because Biden was in office. That I think if Trump had been in power still, and you saw the highest rate of consumer price inflation since the late 1970s, which is what we have seen, I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't have seen left-wing economists being trotted out to try to explain to the average American why rising prices at the grocery store was actually a good thing that stuck it to the rich and helped poor debtors, which is the tack they were trying to explain. Okay, so specifically here, what's the big takeaway? What happened? Well, I think one of the main differences between the monetary injections that the Fed engaged in after the 2009 crisis and what we saw more recently after COVID was that there's various factors here. I got to keep this brief, obviously, for the purposes of this video. But one of the major differences was that following the 2008 crisis, the money the Fed dumped in largely stayed bottled up, if you will, in the financial sector. Okay, there were lots of reasons for this. One thing was that, remember, we were just coming off the housing boom and bust. And so a lot of the banks were very skittish. Their balance sheets were shot. And so they didn't want to engage in more lending unless it was to extremely safe outlets. And so that's why the Fed dumping in all these new excess reserves, even though the banks, the commercial banks, had the legal ability to expand, their lending portfolio on top of those new reserves, as they would have done in more normal times in previous decades, they chose not to. And so that's one reason, again, that this was somewhat contained. Another element involved was that in October of 2008, the Fed enacted a policy change where they began paying interest on reserves. Okay, so throughout the Fed's history, up until this point in the fall of 2008, the Fed did not pay banks interest on the bank's own checking accounts, if you will, on deposit with the Fed. They changed that in October of 2008, that the Fed began paying interest on reserves. So the way I like to summarize it at the time when I was going around giving talks to people just trying to explain what the heck happened with the housing market and what was the Fed doing, I said, even though they're wringing their hands and saying, oh boy, we hate to have to do this, we hate to have to bail out Wall Street here, but you know what? We need to bail out Wall Street to keep credit flowing to Main Street, right? That was the line they gave that, hey, we got to do this just to keep the banking system up and running. So it was ironic that right when they were justifying TARP and the other measures of support being given to the banking system in particular to prop up the value of mortgage-backed securities, that the Fed at that moment began paying commercial banks to not make loans to their customers, right? That's one way of describing this new policy of interest on reserves. Because again, the commercial banks were being told, if you keep your reserves parked here at the Fed, we will start paying you interest on it. And again, that was a brand new policy at that point. All right. So that was part of the reason why those rounds of QE at the time did not translate into that much more money in the hands of the general public, which they then went out to the store and spent. In contrast, fast forward to 2020, the Fed again dumps boatloads of new money into the system. But this time, it wasn't in the context of a financial crisis, right? So it wasn't that people were terrified of their stock of money and that they were just moving money into their checking account balance out of their money market mutual fund, things like that, which they had been doing back in the fall 2008. Here, people were panicked, but it wasn't because they were worried about the banking system. They were worried about other things like COVID. And so coupled with the fact that the government began issuing all the stimulus checks to maintain households who were being ordered to stay home, you sort of had the 1-2 punch where the Fed's dumping in boatloads of new money and the federal government was providing a mechanism by which all households in America were getting this stream of new income coming in that they could then go spend. And then one last layer on top of that in terms of understanding, like, how come food prices spike so much over the next few years? It was partly because given the lockdown and everything else going on, there were only limited channels where those households could spend their money for that period during the lockdowns and shortly thereafter. And so again, all those factors coming together is what fueled that. So again, I think Americans saw firsthand that, oh yes, the experts here, they don't have things under control, and the people poo-pooing the inflation fears obviously did not have their best interests at heart. One last thing I'll say before we move on from this topic. Some defenders of the Federal Reserve System or apologists for the status quo, they will dismiss the fears of guys like Ron Paul when they're talking about, hey, end the Fed and look at the Fed's debased the value of the currency and the dollar's lost whatever it is, 99% of its purchasing power, since its foundation in 1913 and so forth. And some people will poo-poo that and say, oh yeah, but wages are higher than they otherwise would have been, right? So it's just a big wash that yes, prices in general are higher, but that includes wages. And so, the average person's fine. And that's not correct. All right. So it is true that the amount of dollars you earn per hour working at a regular job now, that's higher than it would have been in the year 1930. And partly that's just because the dollar's weaker now. So that part is true, but it's not true that it's all a wash. Okay. And I will put this a link in the show notes page. I've written on this here at Infineo just to go through the logic of it and show that it definitely helps to be in control of the printing press, right? So the Federal Reserve issues the new dollars. The federal government gets access early on in that process by issuing debt that then indirectly, through the primary dealers and so forth, gets monetized the way our current system works. But there is a sense in which the people who have access to that new money first or second or third in line, they're the relative beneficiaries, whereas the people later on in the queue who have to wait for that new money to sort of change hands several times before they start seeing it, they're the relative losers. So it is true, once the whole process is up and running and there's new boatloads of money coming into the economy year after year, that yes, prices in general rise, and that includes the wages of regular people, but it's not that it's an immediate one-for-one impact such that everybody's breaking even and nobody benefits and nobody loses. That's not the case. If you thought that were the case, just ask yourself, if there's going to be somebody in your neighborhood who has a counterfeit printing press, someone cranking out $100 bills, as that person goes out and spends it, that pushes up prices, okay, and eventually pushes up wages. But is it a matter of indifference to you who owns that printing press, right? It doesn't matter to you whether it's your neighbor down the street who has it or whether you have it. Wouldn't you want to be the one to get those $100 bills first if you weren't going to go to jail for counterfeiting? And I think the obvious answer is yes. Given that there's somebody printing new money, whether literally physical currency or more generally electronic transactions, but given that there's some engine of the creation of new legal tender US dollars entering the economy, obviously the organization that's in control of that engine is at an advantage. Okay. And so the fact that we've seen how much the dollar's lost in its value over the last century clearly indicates that the entity issuing dollars is making out like bandits. Okay, moving along now. What's the second thing that I want to explain to you in terms of how my thinking has changed. Well, when I was younger, part of the standard worldview of economists, particularly those who were fans of the free market and who were exposed to the Chicago school of financial economics, it was pretty standard in that genre of thought to say that, hey, you can't beat the market, right? There's a random walk on Wall Street, if you've heard that, and any information that's available publicly, at least, is reflected in current market prices, and it's a fool's errand. Don't trust, don't give your money to active money managers. Just put it all into a mutual fund or, some other broad-based index, and that trying to time the market is silly and so forth. And okay, so there's all that. And really the ideal strategy, they would say, is just buy and hold, right? Just go ahead and put your money into a broad range of funds and, S&P 500 or whatever it is, and just sit tight and just keep doing your dollar cost averaging and so on. And don't worry if the market comes down, if the market goes up, if you're reading information about, people are saying there's going to be a crash, don't try to get out in time, and don't, because you know what? You don't know anything that all these smart quants on Wall Street don't know. All that information's already been taken into account. Current stock prices reflect that. The only way you should be doing some sort of particular stock trades or, engage in some form of market timing is if you have access to this hidden knowledge that other people don't know about. That's the only justification you could have, right? So that was kind of the conventional wisdom. And there is a large degree of truth in that, right? That's a good baseline framework when you're just getting into this stuff, just to say intellectually, how should I think about how the stock market works and the role of market prices, right? An example I use a lot is to say, it would be silly if you thought, I'm new to investing. What should I do? I know I'm going to get into Christmas trees in November because those things are going to skyrocket in demand going into December, and I'll make a killing in that sector. Or I'm going to buy the stock of firework manufacturers in late June because I know going into July 4th, fireworks sales are going to go, right? That would be silly. You're not going to make above average returns investing on those two ideas because everybody knows about Christmas trees and the fact that 4th of July, a lot of people shoot off fireworks. Okay. So the stock prices or the investment returns in the Christmas tree industry or in the fireworks sector, obviously that stuff's already priced in. You're not going to make money there. Okay. But having said that, it's not wrong, I think, for people to read up on like the causes of the business cycle. So for example, I and many of my colleagues coming from what's called the Austrian School of Economics, we were quite concerned about loose monetary policy that was fueling the housing bubble. And there are plenty of Austrians on record and other commentators who are familiar with the Austrian school, or just more generally people who are fans of what you might call hard money, who were very concerned in the years 2003, 2004, up through 2007, saying this housing bubble that's being blown up is unsustainable. People need to watch out for this. Okay. And all along the way, if you saw like guys like Peter Schiff going on CNBC or whatever, there are critics literally laughing in his face as late as 2006, early 2007, when he was warning that housing is way overvalued and we're going to see a big correction. People need to watch out for that. People literally laughing in his face, saying that's crazy talk. Okay. And then, of course, those people were right. So my point is simply that I think as an economist, there are structural forces. I don't think business cycles are random. I don't think it's the case that stock prices truly follow a, quote, random walk, and that, they just keep going up, and there's these shocks that hit, and it's just a statistical thing, and who can say what no, I think if you understand how the economy works, the role of central banks and commercial banks in fueling unsustainable booms and then busts, that gives you an edge as an investor. Now, to be clear, that information by itself is not enough. It's not sufficient, but certainly you shouldn't just throw it out the window and say, well, how can we know? Right? I think there's plenty of indicators that people can rely on to give them guidance as to what's the structural forces facing the macro economy going forward. Okay. So again, I think that's why it's not enough just to put your money into a broad-based index fund and just say, I'm not going to worry about the financial news. That no, you do need to pay attention to this stuff. At the very least, you can do things like being long the stock market, but having deeply out of the money puts, for example. Like that sort of strategy is something like a guy like Mark Spitznagel might endorse. Okay, so I'm just saying there's lots of different ways that you can take your knowledge of the basic business cycle, assuming you're right? All this stuff obviously if you're correct in your views as to how the economy works, how can that hurt you? And again, if you say, well, how come other people aren't doing it? Well, because people have disagreements. Okay. And so somebody who's investing with one philosophy, they might miss something that other people, to them, it's obvious. Right. And people can disagree. And then how does that shake out in the financial sector? Well, the people who are right more often than not tend to earn profits. And there's nothing about the nature of economic science that says, no, it's all a wash. And if you make a profit, it's just because you got lucky. It could be that you did get lucky, but the point is, I don't think economics per se rules out the possibility that people with genuine insight into how markets work, that there's some reason that they can't do better financially armed with that knowledge. To some of you, that might be surprising that I have to say that. But again, that is sort of the baseline that a lot of people have coming out of some of the writings from like the Chicago school tradition regarding financial markets. Okay, what's the third insight I want to talk about? It is the release of the Bitcoin white paper and more generally, the adoption of blockchain technology. All right, so before Bitcoin came on the scene, there had been a tradition among certain economists of talking about how the private sector could not only return to hard physical commodity money like gold and silver, and how that would be preferable, we thought, to state-issued fiat money, but even the possibility of private sector issuance of fiat money. Right, so Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics back in 1974, a disciple of Ludwig von Mises, so a famous Austrian economist, Friedrich Hayek actually had a monograph where he was talking about the possibility of different firms issuing their own tokens that were unbacked fiat money, if you know those terms. You know, they weren't claims on something else like gold and silver or a bunch of wheat or pork bellies. No, it was just a token that these different firms might issue that the public would come to accept because the firms would do a good job maintaining their purchasing power or what other characteristics that the public wanted. Okay, and so Hayek's point was, in general, we don't trust the state to provide automobiles or television sets, right? That we don't think that the state is very good at producing things. So why would we give the state a monopoly on the production of money? That seems like a bad idea. And so Hayek just wrote this monograph talking about, I think it was in the 70s, it was called the denationalization of money. So he wrote this article or this longer piece, just going through the logic of it. And just to say, you can imagine, again, not just a return to physical gold and silver coins that are issued by private mints, which had happened historically, but even couldn't you have companies issuing tokens that are just, they just trade, they're in and of themselves. So that was an interesting theoretical curiosity, but I think what Bitcoin really did was just allow that, take it one step further, because Hayek did not conceive of the peer-to-peer technology that Satoshi made possible. Like, was showing us the intellectual developments needed to actually implement this so that you could have a decentralized public ledger where people could, just using their private key, sort of move Satoshis around or Bitcoins around on the ledger in terms of from one address to another without any one person or group, quote, being in charge. Okay, so that was a fascinating development, just showing the power of spontaneous order, decentralization. And for me, part of the benefit of this vis-a-vis standard economic theory is that now the public can see, oh yeah, we don't need the state to issue money. Whereas, people growing up in my generation or basically anybody who's alive right now, as I'm recording this video, we've all grown up in worlds where the state, it's just assumed, is in charge of issuing the money. And people saying, oh, you don't need the government to do that, they sound like crazy nut jobs. And so Bitcoin, I think, is showing that something that is a money-like asset, right? It's without more widespread adoption, don't want to actually call it money, but certainly if more people started using it in their everyday transactions, at some point it would qualify as a genuine money. And so I think that's a good example just to show you don't need it to be monopolized by the state. The other interesting element of Bitcoin is with its hard cap of 21 million units, that's the most it's ever going to issue, it's introducing all of the users of Bitcoin to the notion of scarcity and how it's fine to have a currency that's not inflating. And everybody just realizes, oh yeah, so what's going to happen is, as the mining of new Bitcoins into existence tapers off and eventually goes to zero, we realize it can still work. The issue is just that prices quoted in Bitcoin will gently fall over time, right? So once the stock of Bitcoins is fixed, if prices are quoted in Bitcoins or Satoshis, for smaller things, that if real GDP is 3%, well, then you could just have prices quoted in those things, Satoshis or Bitcoins could just gently drop 3% a year, right? That's how you could have that system work. And there's nothing crazy about that, right? Our futures contracts and whatever, people are borrowing in Bitcoins or Satoshis would just take that into account when they're figuring out what's the implicit interest or what's the interest rate they're going to charge. They could just take that stuff into account, right? So I think this sort of undermines the narrative that the central bankers and their apologists have cultivated, wherein people think it's normal that, oh yeah, everybody knows that your currency needs to drop in value 2 to 3% a year, and that's just normal and optimal. And no, it really isn't. So I think as more people get interested in Bitcoin and understand how it would work as a money, that they see that, oh yeah, these narratives we're being fed are unsupportable. The other interesting development along these lines is, on the one hand, you've got this super hard currency like Bitcoin that comes on the scene and starts intriguing people. And when I say hard, I mean even more so than gold and silver, right? Because there's not a limit. I mean, in a sense, there's only a finite amount of gold and silver contained on the sphere of planet Earth. But if for all practical purposes, if the market price of gold rises, they can go dig up more gold, right? And there's deposits maybe in asteroids and things that ultimately humans can go get if they want more gold. And maybe in the far-flung future, scientists will come up with a way that they can just go down the subatomic level and rearrange quarks and whatnot and be able to mass produce gold or silver in the lab, using technology like from Star Trek or something. Okay, so there is a sense in which gold and silver, even though right now, given our technology, are certainly more scarce than US dollars or euros or Japanese yen, which can just be created, almost infinitely just with the snap of the fingers. Gold and silver, that's not the case. But with Bitcoin, that's even harder, as it were. So what's interesting is more and more people are getting intrigued by Bitcoin and, a super hard currency and how that would work. On the flip side, you have the rise of MMT, or modern monetary theory, where they're preaching the virtues of a soft currency. And they're trying to explain to people how governments being liberated from their currency's ties to gold and silver, that's actually a good thing. And now governments can spend money, and the only thing they need to worry about is inflationary pressures. There's no problem with coming up with the money, right? So I'm not going to dwell on MMT in this quick video where I'm just running through various topics, but I just want to explain that to me, that's the big divide that we're going to see in the future, is the people pushing hard money, fans of traditional gold bug, fans of physical commodity monies like gold and silver, but then also the Bitcoin aficionados. And on the other hand, the proponents of MMT, who think it's a great virtue that the modern nation state no longer has its hands tied with these golden fetters and that they can spend money at will. And the only thing stopping them is that the public might start grumbling if prices rise too rapidly. The fourth innovation I want to discuss. So here, this is related to the developments with Bitcoin. And here I'm talking about the rise of rideshare systems like Uber and Lyft, but also Airbnb, right? So that genre of new products and services that are facilitated with the widespread adoption of smartphones and all the technological infrastructure necessary to make an Uber or a Lyft or an Airbnb possible, whereas this would not have been possible 40 years ago. And so here, the great innovation, just besides the coordination problem that economists might like to focus on, and how you can have, it's a lot easier now, somebody with a spare bedroom, as long as they just get integrated into Airbnb's network, that it's easier for them to, when the kids go back to college and the bedroom is spare, to just rent that out periodically, right? It's real easy to do these sort of one-off transactions, or somebody who's driving for Uber or Lyft and, oh yeah, New Year's Eve is coming up and, I have the day off from my day job, and yeah, I'd be willing to work for those 6 hours when, it's real prime time, and right, those sorts of, the gig economy, as another way of putting it, that's just so much more easy, or so much easier to facilitate now. and to coordinate all the different people's supply and demand for those various services than it would have been in a more traditional setting where if somebody went down, for certainly to try to buy a taxi cab and to do it that way, or again, someone taking out an ad in the newspaper like, hey, I have a room to rent, and if you're interested, call me up at this number, right? So it's just so much easier now with everything being online and everyone having smartphones to coordinate all this. But beyond that, just in terms of the technology and the coordination element, there's also the public now, again, gets to see the flaws in the traditional justification coming from state-friendly economists and others, policy wonks, explaining why is it that we have such tight limits on who can drive taxi cabs, right? So like in places like New York City, you need what's called a medallion, right? It's a very expensive process to get the legal ability to be able to drive a taxi cab. I think the market value of those vouchers that give you permission, they're definitely in the tens of thousands. I haven't looked at the number recently, but I've seen it being over $100,000. Okay, so what does that do? Well, standard economics, if you limit the supply in a certain industry, it's a cartel, and that raises prices and reduces quality for consumers. And that's certainly what you have in major cities where there's tight restrictions on who can drive a cab. And so traditionally, the way the defenders of that status quo would have justified it is to say, oh, well, you can't have these, the public needs to know, oh, if I see a yellow cab, that's safe, that those drivers have been vetted, the government signs off on them, I can get in there, the person's not going to rip me off, the fares are going to be, according to some formula, and they're not going to just, take me down to some deserted alley and rob me. Whereas if just random people in their cars, you get off the plane and you come out and there's just some guy there, hey, you need a ride? I'll give you a ride. You can't trust that, right? We need to have strict regulation. Well, everybody now who's been using Uber and Lyft and so forth knows that official story is bogus, right? Uber and Lyft are much safer in terms of accountability. And, you can see that, oh yes, if this person's in their network, then the only way they can stay in the network is if their customers, have been giving them good ratings and so on. It's in Uber and Lyft's interest to do a background check before they let somebody become a driver and so forth. That's not good for business if somebody gets kidnapped or the Uber driver takes them somewhere and their buddies rob them. That's not good for business for them. So you just see, and they're much cleaner vehicles typically, right? They're certainly depending too on which class of car that you select when you go ahead and schedule the ride. And so for all those reasons, people can see, oh yeah, it's easier, more convenient, oftentimes cheaper and safer to take Uber or Lyft rather than the conventional old school government approved cabs. And so that's, for me, that's why this is such an important innovation, is so not just in this context, but then just the lesson it teaches. And so now if I'm talking about relaxing constraints on other sectors where the government says, oh, no, it has to be our approved people, nobody else should be allowed to do it, you can start to see things like in healthcare, for example. Right, partly why healthcare prices are so high is that there's rigid government rules in place as to who's legally allowed to practice medicine or who's even allowed to be a nurse and come check your blood pressure while you're waiting to see the doctor, right? And so relaxing those standards, not, to be clear, not saying there should be no standards and anybody can do it, but as Uber and Lyft and Airbnb show, no, you can have private companies acting as the middlemen, as it were, between the providers and the ultimate customers. And so they can do the vetting, right? So you can see that there could be a role for somebody to certify nurses or even pediatricians and such without relying just on the government approved certification boards. And so if you've seen with your own eyes how Uber and Lyft and even eBay and so forth with their private ratings, and you can kind of get an idea, is this person a trustworthy seller? If I send them my money, are they going to ship me the product? You don't need to rely on, well, if they don't, I'm going to call the government and the police will go. No, you can see the ratings from other buyers in the eBay framework and get a sense of, is this person going to send me the thing or not? So I think all that just shows people that with modern technology, especially, we don't need to rely so much on the state to tell us who's trustworthy or not. And even as I say that, like, isn't that kind of insane? Who are we turning to say, please tell us who's trustworthy and competent? Oh, the people in Washington, D.C. or wherever your government capital is if you're outside the U.S. Okay, next topic, the fall of the Soviet Union. So this was a major event, not only in terms of world history and cultural, sociological impacts and so forth, but when it comes to economic theory, this was a huge vindication of the critique of socialism that people like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and others advanced going back decades, right? So there was a famous, what's called the socialist calculation debate in the 1920s and 30s, where it really raged, where Ludwig von Mises launched one of the early salvos in this. And what he argued was that there is a fundamental structural flaw with socialism. And in there, he was being very specific about with his terminology. So he meant specifically, if the state takes over ownership of the means of production. Okay, so you can still have, individual carpenters, they can still own their hammers and tool kits and whatnot. And, maybe even farmers, if it's just like a local, a small farm or whatever, they might even be able to have some chickens and whatever. But in terms of large scale enterprises like factories or, large scale commercial farms, things like that, anything in terms of large industry, that's what the government would own. Okay. That's what true socialism is that if the government owns, again, what the original socialist writers would refer to as the means of production. And so what Mises said is that sort of system, it can't work. It cannot function as a way to rationally allocate resources. And so the way Mises, he made a very quick argument. He said, I will stipulate, for the sake of argument, let's assume that the central planners, the people trying to plan the economy in a, quote, rational way, let's assume that, they're angels, that they have the best interests of their people at heart. In practice, that's not true. In practice, you give a group of people the power to run an economy, and they're going to abuse that power. As history shows, people like Stalin and Mao, had no problem starving millions of their own people as punishment for, defying them. And so in practice, you don't want to give a small group of people power over the whole economy, because that's the power of life and death. Okay. But Mises said, put that aside. He also said, put aside the incentive problem, right? That under socialism, if you reward people not on the basis of their own contributions, but according to some other criteria, right? Like you don't pay a worker based on how much did he contribute, but instead you say, well, how many kids does he have? Okay. And so that, we're going to pay you more because you got more kids to take care of or whatever, right? If you do it that way and you sever the connection between personal output and how much you get to consume out of the total social pie, well, then there's an incentive issue. And then, everybody in that kind of a system wants to get the real easy jobs. Like, yeah, how about you assign me to be the checkout clerk at the library rather than somebody who's, emptying the garbage cans, right? Or digging ditches. Okay. And so there's that element. And that's a problem with socialism in the real world. But Mises said, assume that away. Let's just give the socialists that and assume we have a socialist community where all the people are really dedicated to the effort, and they're going to just work their hearts, and they're going to do whatever it is that the top-down planners say is in this blueprint. Okay, so again, Mises is trying to be very fair here to still isolate this insurmountable problem. He said, nonetheless, the fundamental problem with socialism is that the planners lack prices for the means of production. They don't have market prices for steel, for rubber, for glass, for, certain amounts of wheat, things like this, right? They don't know what is the relative valuation of an hour of a brain surgeon's time versus an hour of a corporate attorney's time versus an hour of the kid bagging groceries at the grocery store's time, right? Whereas under capitalism, you do have market prices for all those things. And okay, a bushel of wheat, how does that compare to a barrel of crude oil? Under a capitalist system where there's private property and those things are traded against money, you have genuine market prices for those things. So you have an idea of the relative valuation, but you don't have that under socialism. And so because of that, Mises argued, the planners, when they're trying to decide, here's how we can take a given amount of inputs and transform them into a given amount of outputs, we have no idea if that's an efficient plan or not, because we don't have a common denominator. All we know are the various quantities of different types of labor, of various skills, various, bushels of wheat, acres of farmland, and so on that we put in. And then we know how many cars we could produce, how many diapers, how many houses, how many bottles of beer, and so forth. And we don't know, is this a good use of resources or not? Under capitalism, we have a test. It's the profit and loss test. And so if the money that your customers give you for your output is higher than the money you spent on the inputs, you earn a profit. And that is the market economy's signal to you as an entrepreneur. You're doing a good job, as you're a wise steward of our scarce resources. So it doesn't mean that if you're turning a profit, you're necessarily a moral person, right? You might be making pornographic materials, or you might be making addictive substances. And so some people might think it's not good for society that you're doing that. But there, Mises says, the real issue is there are consumers who are paying money for the pornography or for the cigarettes or the heroin or whatever it is. And that's the issue, that sometimes people, in your view, if you're a paternalist, might not be choosing and spending their money in ways that's good for their souls. So that may be true, he would say, but he's just saying, as an economist, the function I'm telling you of the market economy prices is to show this is how, you should steer resources and why top-down central planning doesn't work. So for a long time, the mainstream economics profession resisted that and thought Mises was wrong. But then with the fall of the Soviet Union, more and more economists came around to the idea that, oh yeah, top-down central planning really doesn't work. You do need a market economy. You do need private property. This leads into the next issue, climate change economics. So here I did a lot of work on this topic. I've testified before Congress on numerous occasions. I'm going to get into a little bit of the details in a moment here, but big picture, I think one thing you need to realize is with the fall of the Soviet Union and the discrediting of top-down central planning and outright socialism, many of the former socialists, they still detested capitalism, but they just moved into the green movement. All right. So rather than just openly advocating for the downfall of capitalism to be replaced with either socialism or outright communism in some cases, that they realized, okay, this isn't going to fly anymore. And so let's change our tune. And, oh no, we just want to save the environment. We got to protect Mother Earth from the ravages of excessive consumption and so forth. And so with that, to be clear, I'm not saying that's the case for every single person who's concerned about climate change. I'm not saying, oh yeah, they're all secret Marxists. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that the actual Marxists did move, they changed their strategy. They realized we need to shift gears, and now we'll work through the industry of promoting awareness and activism related to climate change. That was what they pivoted to. Okay, now let me just give you one example of when I say that the actual underlying science, by which I mean the economic literature on this, does not at all line up with the activists. Okay, so here again, to be clear, I'm an economist. I am not qualified to talk about, oh, is it really true that if this many tons of CO2 are emitted over the next 30 years, what's going to happen to the, average global temperature or so forth? I'm familiar with that literature, but that's not my area of expertise. And so I want to be clear here. I am not saying, oh, that science is wrong. Here's what I am saying, that there is a step involved to go from this is what the physical science says in terms of these are the likely projected impacts of more emissions on global temperature, things like that, to then say, so what should, if anything, should governments do about it? Right? There's a lot more involved. It's not obvious just to go from here are some statements about how the physical climate system works to then say, and this is what government should do, right? There's more analysis needed. Somebody who is an expert at understanding how the atmosphere works and how to model it and the heat exchange between, the land and oceans and things like that. Somebody who's an expert in that does not necessarily know how to optimally design a system to tax carbon, right? That's the area where economists really have the expertise. Okay, so having said that, let me just give you this one example to show the huge chasm between what the actual credentialed economists were saying in this area versus what the activists are saying or telling everyone, to follow the science. So specifically, the same weekend that William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in economics for his contributions and pioneering efforts in the field of the economics of climate change, the same weekend that he won the Nobel Prize for that, the UN released a special report on the economics of climate change and specifically on how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what's interesting about that, the two kind of went hand in hand, right? Oh, Nobel Committee gives an award to this guy for his work on the economics of climate change is a really important issue. And the UN comes out showing the world, here's various mechanisms and steps we can take to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's relative to pre-industrial baseline. That's what that figure means. Okay, so here's what's interesting. William Nordhaus's own work, and he's not a right-wing free marketeer by any stretch. No, he is a left-of-center Keynesian economist. William Nordhaus is, okay? So he's not a laissez-faire kind of guy. William Nordhaus's own work, for which he just won the Nobel Prize at this time, right, showed that the trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius was such a draconian, over-the-top threshold or goal that it would have imposed so much damage to the economies around the world if the governments foolishly tried to implement that the resulting damage would be so awful, it would actually be better for humanity if governments did nothing with respect to climate change than if they tried to actually limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so do you understand what I'm saying there? That the same weekend, Nordhaus gets the Nobel Prize for his work on this topic, and the UN comes out saying, hey, governments of the world, here's how we can try to achieve this ambitious but important goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The guy who got the Nobel Prize in that same weekend, his work showed that goal that they were touting, the UN was putting forward, was so disastrous, it would be better if governments did nothing rather than trying to achieve that goal. All right. And then just again, to show the divide and how there's politics involved, when the New York Times was interviewing Nordhaus after, for winning the prize, and they said to him as like one of the last questions of the interview, what do you think about, the prospects for humanity achieving the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, as a cap on warming? And he just said something like, I don't think we can achieve it at this point. Right. And that's how he ended. So you see, he was being very coy. He didn't say, and thank goodness, because that'd be awful. So that's, and I don't, I guess I can't blame him because right now he's a hero getting, celebrated by everybody. Whereas, if he had actually said what his model's implications were, the climate activists would have denounced him. That's one other thing on this before I move on. That's also what I observed in my experience in this field is early on, the climate activists and, progressive think tanks and whatever, they were touting the published economics of climate change literature because it was moving people towards the direction of, oh yes, this is why, there's a so-called market failure. You need to have a tax on carbon and whatnot. And you don't listen to those laissez-faire economists. This is standard economics. If there's a negative externality, the free market fails, you need this, right? So the climate activists were happy to defer to people like Nordhaus back in the 1980s when he was first really developing his model and talking about the time he thought of as the dangers of carbon dioxide emissions, how it was a market failure that demanded government action and so on. But then over time, as this stuff became more mainstream, the activists no longer had use for Nordhaus because his model could only, in his framework, he could justify a tax on carbon, but it wasn't very high because he was showing if you tax it too much, that just causes too much economic damage. And that, on net, that hurts humans more than global warming does. And so his model could justify some government intervention, but not nearly what the socialists needed because they wanted to dismantle capitalism. So that's kind of my point here is it really revealed a lot of these people, they were using the climate change arguments because really they wanted to undermine capitalism. I don't have time to do it in this short video, but there's hosts of quotes I could provide to you from, various people at the UN, various environmentalist organizations and so on to back up what I'm saying, that these people, it's not merely that they care about limiting global warming, it's they don't like capitalism. Humans are consuming too much. They need to be punished. There are too many people on planet Earth. We need to reduce population. That's what's driving a lot of these activists. Okay, next topic, the role of banks in financial crises. So here's what's interesting is the global financial crisis of 2008 rekindled a lot of mainstream economists' interest in the topic of, what causes the business cycle? And then the Nobel Award in 2022 went to Ben Bernanke and then Diamond Dybvig for their models of how the banking system communicates shocks that then feed into the broader economy. All right. So what's interesting here, I'll be very brief, is that some of us, like I said, I've been a member of the Austrian school, and here for decades, Ludwig von Mises, followed up by Friedrich Hayek, developed a theory as how the business cycle is caused by the banking system, right? And then in a society where they have a central bank, that just exacerbates the problem, right? So according to Mises and Hayek, what causes the business cycle is that the banking system pumps in credit that's artificial, pushes interest rates down to artificially low levels, that fuels a boom, but it's unsustainable, right? It's not backed up by genuine saving. Times seem good for a while. The stock market's booming, unemployment, the official numbers come down, but then price inflation starts rising. The central bank and the commercial banks start getting nervous. They take their foot off the gas. Eventually, they might even slam the brakes. Interest rates spike. The yield curve inverts. And then the economy crashes. Okay, so that's the standard Austrian story of what causes the business cycle. Even on, sort of left-wing economists, heterodox economists, people like who favor Minsky and, sort of instability theorists, they also think that the banking sector has a role to play. So they're coming from a different angle, and in terms of our policy prescriptions, they'd be different. But my point is the heterodox economists had been arguing for many decades that yes, the banking system is what's at fault here. That's what's fueling the boom-bust cycle, whereas mainstream economists, that was, in many cases, that literally wasn't even in their model. There are mainstream models of the macroeconomy that are guiding central bankers, where in the model itself, there are no banks, right? Just to give you an idea of just how crude some of these models are, even though they're held by, developed by Nobel Prize-winning economists who are running central banks. So to me, that was something that was very interesting that came out of the global financial crisis, was that finally the economics profession had to start taking seriously the heterodox views, both from the Austrians and the post-Keynesian types who were saying banks are important. Another major development has to do with globalization. More generally, the issues of free trade, immigration, as capital has become much more globally accessible, easier to move among jurisdictions, and as the immigration crises have, struck all over the globe, economists are, being put in a position now to go back and rethink some of their orthodoxy. So here, for example, it has long been the orthodox view among economists that free trade is optimal. And I still personally believe that. However, there is an element now where some people, especially those like associated with Donald Trump and his former administration and, an upcoming one if he gets reelected, were saying, okay, but what if we put in place a tariff, but we use the revenues to get rid of the income tax, right? That's a separate issue to model, okay? And so again, you could simultaneously believe free trade is ideal, that, if you started out from a baseline of no taxation and you just said, does it make America richer if the government implements a tariff on foreign imports? And I think in that environment, yes, it's still correct to say it does not make America richer, that any gains to individual, workers by restricting cheap imports is offset by the losses to consumers because now they have to pay more to get those finished goods, right? That's just kind of the way it shakes out. But that is not the same thing as saying, given that the government right now is going to tax Americans to raise revenue to spend it on whatever the government spends the money on, would it make sense to shift away from taxing income to taxing imports through a tariff? And so that's a separate question. And I think there is there's a lot to be said for a transition like that, particularly if you could, in the extreme, get rid of the income tax altogether, right? Because just for privacy reasons, if you are taxing imports, you don't need to get into the business of every household and know what are all your sources of income and so on. Whereas the existence of the income tax, even if you're not paying that much, just you having to file the government's all in your business and knows everything you're up to. Okay. And so just for privacy reasons, there's a huge element that way. And then also, of course, immigration, again, a huge topic, but economists are having to revisit a lot of these debates and just look at the impact of, immigrants coming into a region. What does that do to the wage structure and so forth? Last thing I'll mention is since the 1990s, there has been a huge innovation in the economic literature about the effects of a minimum wage. So specifically in the 1980s, there was a broad consensus both on the left and the right in terms of, the economics profession, that they said raising the minimum wage does not help low-skill workers or poor workers, put it that way. It's a very blunt instrument, and that they said if the government wants to help, there's other policies they could implement that make a lot more sense, like an earned income tax credit, things like that. Okay, or just other targeted subsidies to try to help working families, like you could have child care subsidies or things like that, worker training programs. But to just have this law in place saying, oh no, if you're gonna, you have to pay a certain minimum or not, that if there's a worker out there who has low skill, some teenage kid who's 17, he doesn't have a great educational background because, he comes from an area where the schools were bad and, had gangs in them or whatever. And he's got a difficult home life. And so he, sometimes he has to call in, he can't show up for work. Somebody like that, if the government just has a flat rule that, oh no, you have to pay that person $7.25 an hour, when really, in terms of what does that kid give to the employer is really only $6 an hour. It's not the employer's going to just eat it and hire the kid and just lose money on him. No, he's just not going to get hired, right? So that was the consensus in the 80s, was that the minimum wage was a very blunt instrument that ended up making it hard for the most disadvantaged workers to get their foot in the door, to get a job in the first place. And then it's kind of a catch-22. If no one will hire you, you have no experience. But if you have no experience, no one wants to hire you, right? So the idea among left and right economists was that the minimum wage was a poor policy. That consensus started to be overturned. The starting point that people point to was a 1994 paper by these economists Card and Kruger, where they were looking at the minimum wage in New Jersey. And they're just trying to argue the opposite, saying, no, we control for all these factors, and they raised the minimum wage and it didn't reduce teenage employment, relative to their peer groups. Since that publication, there's been a lot of critics who have raised objections to that particular paper. You could take it or leave it. But in general now, there have been plenty of papers in this new genre of revisionist literature trying to argue that raising the minimum wage is not as deleterious to teenage employment as economists used to think. And so you'll see this discussion. So let me just, wrap up by saying on this, I actually think a lot of this so-called revisionism is overblown. All right. So let me give you the sort of theoretical point and then the broader news you can use. So on the narrow, the theoretical point, as you delve into this literature, here's the kind of thing that happens. So if you do a regression analysis and look at the various states over a 50-year period, states that have a higher minimum wage do tend to have lower teenage employment, right? Just a pure raw regression analysis that if you put the minimum wage level in that given state as one of the independent variables, it does have some statistical explanatory power. Okay, so again, kind of vindicating the old school consensus that, if you make labor, if you make low skilled labor more expensive, employers want to buy fewer units of it. But then this new revisionist literature will come in and put in all sorts of controls to account for other things that might be skewing the results. And then once you put in all those extra controls and bells and whistles, now the explanatory power of that minimum wage goes away. And so what I'm concerned about is, looking at it to make sure that we're not just assuming away the problem, is if you read this literature and you say, well, okay, what kind of things are you controlling for? One of the things they would control for is the rise of automation. And so, what they'll say is effectively, oh yes, if you look around, at the fast food restaurants in the various states, the states that have a higher minimum wage, it is true, they tend to have less, fewer teenagers working at their fast food restaurants than in the states that didn't raise their minimum wage. And so, a normal, I would say as an economist, right. So you're hurting teenagers in the state by raising the minimum wage because now it's harder for them to get a job at McDonald's and Burger King because you're making them artificially more expensive. So why does the employer want to hire them now? It's not helping them. But then the defender of the policy will come back and say, oh, no. We don't know that it's the higher minimum wage driving that, because if we also put into the regression a control for the amount of automation among those fast food chains, we see that, in those states that have, yes, a higher minimum wage and lower teenage employment, they also tend to have more automation in their fast food restaurants relative to the states that don't have a higher minimum wage. And so it's not really that, the guy who owns the McDonald's or the Burger King is hiring fewer teenagers in the state with the high minimum wage because the minimum wage is higher. No, he's doing it because he brought in kiosks and other, labor-saving devices more rapidly than, the franchise owners in the other state that didn't raise the minimum wage. And so that's why he's not hiring more. So do you see the problem with that? It's not an independent decision as to whether you're going to, as a franchise owner, bring in automation. That presumably the people who own the McDonald's and the Burger King franchises in states that are, debating whether to raise the minimum wage, or if it's already on the books and next year the minimum wage is going to go up. What are you going to do? You're going to look into bringing in more kiosks and other, automations so that you can get through and, still run your business by carrying a smaller payroll. That's obviously one thing you would do. So, so anyway, that's what I'm just saying. Like, that's one of the, getting in the weeds in terms of statistically what these papers are doing that seem to show, look at raising the minimum wage actually isn't such a bad thing after all. Okay. Besides that, though, just big picture, even on their own terms, what these papers show empirically is that if you have a relatively modest hike in the minimum wage, it doesn't have a large negative impact on teen employment. Okay. But people right now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. So people talking about, we got to fight for 15, or I've even seen higher ones now, people wanting like $20 an hour. That's a doubling or more of the existing minimum wage. So none of this literature shows if you doubled the minimum wage, that's not going to have a huge impact on teen employment. And so as far as real world scenarios, I think we see this playing out in some Western states now that they did have aggressive hikes in their minimum wage, and there have been more predictable impacts on, fast food employment and so on. Okay, well, that's a good place to wrap up. I hope you've enjoyed this video of me breaking down the biggest insights and learning that I've experienced over the last several years. And all of this has pushed me to become more of a free market libertarian economist, that the more I study this, the more I see that, yes, markets work, state intervention doesn't. If you like this video, you're going to love my previous one where I took a look throughout history to explain why some of the dangerous policy positions being floated by Kamala Harris could absolutely ravage the U.S. economy and the stock market. So if you want to watch that video, go ahead and check it out. Click that link, and it's going to take you straight to it. Thanks for your attention, everybody. See you next time.